Hope you are doing well. Today, horror incident about unseen entity or demon. It's the story of a nurse from 2015. Mrs. Agnes has been unconscious since yesterday. We, who are standing around her, can only watch, unable to do anything more. Dr. Jimmy has done his best and looks resigned about this particular patient. He just sits watching the monitor next to the bed. A few moments later, Mrs. Agnes's heartbeat weakens and weakens further. Finally, the family's sobs break the silence of the room when around 1 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Agnes passes away. My name is Britt, and I work as a nurse in a hospital in the city center. I've been in this profession for about 5 years, a job I've dreamed of since childhood. It's a job I consider very noble. I enjoy doing this work, almost all of it with great pleasure. I love the job, my colleagues, the environment, everything. Almost everything. The hospital where I work is an old establishment, quite aged. Yes, like many old buildings in this city, it still has Dutch architecture. Some parts have been left as they are, never renovated, only the paint is regularly refreshed. According to history, when it was first built, this hospital only had one building and one floor. Now it has several buildings in one complex, one of which has 7 floors. It's a very large and fairly well-known hospital. Tonight, I, with my husband's help, will try to recount one of the incidents I experienced in this hospital. And of course, it was a very eerie incident. Friends, please listen. Remember the message from Spooky Ape Agency. My husband, whether on Reddit, Twitter, or Instagram, never read alone because sometimes they are not just present in the story. Mrs. Agnes is one of the few patients I remember well, primarily because she was hospitalized for quite a long time, about 2 months, until finally, fate decided otherwise, and she passed away in the inpatient room. During those 2 months, we nurses became quite close to her. Coincidentally, Mrs. Agnes was a very friendly person, loved to joke and chat. When she was admitted to the hospital, Mrs. Agnes was 69 years old, thin with long white hair. Her illness was quite severe and complicated. Coincidentally, I was the first to handle and care for her after she came out of the ER. Mrs. Agnes's room was a VIP room, occupied by one patient only. It had a sofa and table for family members who wanted to stay with her. Carefully, I attended to her on the first night, preparing all the necessary needs. Only 2 family members accompanied her, a man in his 40s and a woman around 25. The man stood by the bedside continuously talking to Mrs. Agnes, while the woman sat on the sofa playing with her phone. "That's it, Mom, now you rest. I'm in the nurse's room not far from here. If you need anything, just press the button beside the bed, and I will come immediately." "Thank you, miss," replied Mrs. Agnes with a smile. After that, I walked to the nurse's room at the end of the corridor. Mrs. Agnes's room and the nurse's room were about 30 meters apart. This inpatient room is in the second largest building, a quite old one. That night, only my 2 fellow nurses, Cora and Rihanna, and I were on duty. I sat alone at the nurse's station in front of the room while Cora and Rihanna were still making rounds to patient rooms. Around 11 o'clock, the door of Mrs. Agnes's room opened, and the 2 family members who had been accompanying her since the beginning left the room. "Nurse, I leave my mother to you. We can only stay until now, we will come back tomorrow," said the man, whom I later found out was Mrs. Agnes's son. "All right, sir," I replied kindly. Then they left. I sat alone at the desk in front of the nurse's station while Cora and Rihanna were in the room right behind me. The long, empty corridor was what I saw ahead, with doors of inpatient rooms lined up on both sides, not all occupied, only a few. Very quiet and still, a situation we and our friends are used to when on night duty. It was almost 1 in the morning when I had to make rounds, visiting each patient one by one. Mrs. Agnes's room was the second from the end, and I purposely visited her last. When I stood right in front of the room, from the window, I could see that the light was still brightly on. Before opening the door, I paused for a moment because I heard something. A soft, old song's humming could be heard faintly from inside. Then I knocked before opening the door. It turned out to be Mrs. Agnes singing an old song's tune. "Good evening, ma'am, why haven't you slept?" I asked kindly. "Yes, miss, not sleepy yet. Usually, I sing first to get sleepy. Is it bothering you, miss?" Mrs. Agnes replied with a smile. "It's okay, ma'am, but you should rest to recover soon." Then I stayed with her for a while. In that brief conversation, she told me a bit about her family. Speaking with occasional gasps, she said that earlier, the ones who accompanied her were her second son and his wife, her daughter-in-law. Her eldest son worked abroad, while the youngest daughter lived out of town with her husband. Mrs. Agnes, born in this city, had lived here for years because she followed her husband who worked here. Her husband had long passed away, and after his death, she lived in her second son's house, the one who accompanied her in the room earlier. I listened to her for quite a while, as she seemed very happy to talk, until I had to gently urge her to rest. "I'll dim the lights, ma'am. If you need anything, please press the call button." After that, I left and returned to the nurse's station. That was the first night I met Mrs. Agnes. Mrs. Agnes's fluctuating condition forced her to stay hospitalized. Her condition sometimes drastically worsened due to complications. Nearly 2 months of hospitalization made us nurses close to her. Later we learned that her 3 children were quite well off, so the hospital fees seemed not to be an issue for them. However, only the second son frequently visited, and even then, only a few times a week, countable on fingers. The daughter who lived out of town visited only twice, I remember well. The eldest son was never seen at all. Mrs. Agnes spent most of her time alone, with only us nurses for company. We also got used to hearing her softly hum old tunes before bed, almost every night. Until finally, one night in March, due to her extremely weak condition and beyond help, she took her last breath. Mrs. Agnes passed away. In short, after Mrs. Agnes's body was taken home by her family, we cleaned her room back to its original state. We, who had cared for her during her stay, certainly felt the loss of such a friendly and kind-hearted person who had to leave due to a condition that was indeed very hard to recover from. One of the hardest parts of doing this job. April 2015. 1 o'clock in the morning. The bell in room 11 rang, indicating that the patient inside needed assistance. I quickly went to that room. The patient in room 11 this time was 42 years old, a traffic accident victim. "Is there anything I can help with, sir?" I asked once inside. He slowly grasped and pulled my hand to bring me closer. "Once close enough," he whispered. "There's a woman singing in the bathroom, nurse." Quite startled, I calmly replied. "It might be from the television, sir." Then I walked to the bathroom and opened the door. It was empty, no one there. "There, sir, it's empty. Please rest to recover soon." The man remained silent, still with a worried expression. After that, I left and returned to the nurse's station. That's one story from a patient who happened to be in room 11, the room that a few weeks earlier was occupied by Mrs. Agnes. Several times my fellow nurses and I discussed room 11, the room once occupied by Mrs. Agnes. Some friends told of hearing or feeling strange things when inside or just passing by that room. Often, a woman's voice, singing or humming old songs was heard. The singing voice came from within the room. A brave nurse once opened the room door, which was empty at the time when the singing was heard again. She found nothing, but her whole body trembled with chills. Without a second thought, she immediately left the room. There was also a cleaning staff who had a scary experience. She suddenly saw a woman resembling Mrs. Agnes lying on the bed. Without hesitation, she ran out of the room. Many strange events happened to them, but I never experienced any of them. Until one night, I finally had a terrifying experience that I will remember for life. That night, only 3 rooms had patients, the rest were empty, including room 11. Coincidentally, I was on the night shift, and with 2 other colleagues, we were on duty on that floor. After all visitors had left, the atmosphere returned to very quiet and still, especially as the night grew late. "Brit, we're going to the first floor, someone needs help." Cora's voice startled me, breaking my reverie. "Okay, but don't take too long," I replied. It was 12 midnight when I was alone, sitting at the desk in front of the nurse's station. Then it was time for me to make rounds, visiting each patient and doing other necessary tasks. The patient in the last room needed an infusion replacement, so I had to walk back to the nurse's station to get it. I had to pass room 11, the room where Mrs. Agnes used to stay. The atmosphere was eerily quiet and cold. Unconsciously, I quickened my steps, wanting to finish my task and return to the nurse's station quickly. When passing room 11, I had to walk slowly while pushing the medical trolley. Unintentionally, I glanced at the room's door. Surprised, I stopped. Inside was a woman sitting on the bed, pale-faced with long white hair. I knew for sure, it was Mrs. Agnes. Sitting with a calm face, smiling, looking at me. I felt my heart almost stop. Stunned in place, I tried to keep walking, but my feet felt heavy. Holding back my feelings, I closed my eyes for a moment, hoping what I saw was just an illusion. I took a deep breath and then opened my eyes. Again, I saw the same thing. A white figure with long hair sitting on the bed. Still in shock and trembling, I forced myself to quickly walk past room 11's door. Finally, with a fast pace, I arrived at the nurse's station. That's one incident I experienced myself, and will never forget in my life. So, that's one of my experiences working as a nurse in a hospital. One of many, but this one was very memorable and terrifying. Many other stories from friends and colleagues happened in this hospital, some even scarier. However, all these events seem to be in the past, and we have to move on and continue doing our job with the best dedication we can give. Keep yourself and others safe from any type of scary activity. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.